Hi, folks, with Taskless today. Taskless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about. There have been a few sort of economic reports doing the rounds, or prognostications, not reports, that are attempting quite bravely, in my view, to predict the future. And what's the world going to look like in about 50 years' time? Is sort of the central premise of these papers. And what they're saying is that China and India will be the biggest economies in the world, and by far, not even a close run thing. That and they'll between them they'll control something between 60 and 65% of the world's wealth. Africa will continue to be poor, but what the big sort of shift is that the rich countries of today are slated as being, on a per capita base, slated as being, will be quite poor. And they're saying that the white people or the white regions of the world will go from possessing a disproportionate amount of total global wealth into possessing even less than their population share would suggest they should have. So the white regions that are increasingly no longer white or only part white, or where the globalists are fanatically attempting to dilute whiteness, then they're saying that these will be poor or at best middle income countries. The equivalent to equivalent to a Romania or a Bulgaria or something like that today. So not an Algeria or something. So this is not this is quite sort of confronting and sobering reading, more confronting than sobering, because I'm not sure how accurate it's going to be. Remember, it's talking about 50 years into the future, 50 plus years in the future. So again, it's a courageous person that hangs their hat on these sort of predictions. But that's it nonetheless. Now, again, if you sort of sift through the arguments, they're saying that productivity across the world will even out, so that every citizen or every person anywhere in the world, or in most parts of the world, again, they're saying Africa will stay dirt poor, but most citizens in most parts of the world will be equally productive due to commonality of technology and these sorts of things, and that because of that, because they'll be equally productive, the areas with the largest populations will be the richest. That is China and India. So now that may or may not be so. They're counting that Indonesia will be quite rich in the future because of because they've got a population of over 200 million. So they're quite populous. They're one of the most populous nations on earth. And the Pakistan will be doing all right because they've got quite a big population. So having a look at that, they're like, for example, Turkey, it will be one of the richest nations in that European, Middle Eastern type area, again because of population. Now, I don't know if all citizens are going to be equally productive, as in they will have equal access to the same technology, and thus will be equally productive. I don't think productivity distributes around a population or a region quite like that. But I'll come back to that in a minute. So that effectively they're saying that because of globalization, everyone's going to be about the same, or most people are going to be about the same. Therefore, outcomes will be the same. They also, interestingly, they say China and India will have a homogeneous population, and the argument suggests that will create more social cohesion and will further add to the productivity. And remember, these are pretty pro-globalist folks who are coming out with these sort of prognostications. But by implication, even though this is not said, by implication, the white countries, or hitherto white homogenous countries, are going to have no, they won't be socially homogenous. 40-45% of the population will be white. The rest will be a mixture of brown and black and whatever else, and therefore these places will be less productive due to lack of, given they're arguing social. The fact that all the whole of China is going to be homogenous, and the whole of India is going to be homogenous. then by extension they're saying that it's the Europe that's going to be 40% white will lack that homogeneity and thus will be less productive. So this is an interesting take, and it's almost like the globalists are defeating their own reasoning for stuffing the white West full of brown and black peasants. So let's have a look at this idea that if we look at the great views of history, look at say Portuguese. Now Portugal was quite rich at one point because of all the wealth coming out of Brazil, the gold and the silver and everything. But it was an artificial richness. It wasn't richness. So they had an efficient economy or very productive or anything like that. Far from it. That they were just rich because of the wealth coming out of Brazil, or what is today modern day Brazil. So they thought they were pretty hot shit back in the time in European affairs, and they had a number of quite successful mariners that were circumnavigating the globe, and so they had some achievements to point to. But when when they visited, say, government officials, for example, would visit England in the late 1600s, they were contemptuous to the extreme, and they said that these English will never amount to anything. They're rude, crude, and vulgar. They urinate in the street, and the common man shows no respect to their betters, and and they went through a whole bunch of things, and they thought it was outrageous that there was this sort of vulgar aspirational middle class that was appearing, and so these Portuguese observers, again, one of them was the Portuguese ambassador to the English government, and they just these guys will never amount to anything. They're a bunch of no good loudmouth bums, and that was it. And they wrote the English off. And yet barely 50 years later, England was the world's preeminent power. Barely 50 years afterwards, so it had gone from sort of nowhere to being the premier player on the world stage, and or sharing that with France. And so this was an interesting sort of thing that the other observers would say the same thing. Now, also observers that were traveling through what later became federated Germany, and they were looking at how all the main 20 miles either side of all the main highways, which is where the prime agricultural land was left barren because there was so much warfare and armies traveling to and from and across and up and down that there was no point having a farm anywhere near the roads that these invading armies or even armies just transiting would go through, because the foraging parties would come along, steal all your cattle and all your chickens and anything else that wasn't nailed down. So there's just no point in having a farm, given say it happens so often. Why invest time and energy in crops and building up a viable farm when an invading army was going to come through and take it all? So that was these guys will never amount to anything because they can't even have some fucking farms on the main roads without drama. So that's it. So, and then again 200 years later, Germany was an international powerhouse, and so things can change. Now in the late 1800s, there was a lot of talk about future of the world economy and so on, and there were some changes. People have noticed, and federated Germany was looking economically was looking very strong. United States coming out of the Civil War was industrially quite impressive, and Britain was at the height of its power at the time. So people were looking at what will the future be like. So there was looking at, say, Russia with its relatively large population, and they're saying, well, Russia will be a superpower of the future because of its population. And again, there was this assumption that the productivity of, say, in England, where per capita productivity on a relative basis was quite high, they were saying, well, that productivity will gradually seep into or be taken up by the much larger population of Russia, and therefore Russia will become an economic powerhouse because of its large population. And again, this assumed equality of productivity. around the world. It doesn't happen that way. It's far more patchy than that. But then also the same with the United States. Its population was growing fast, and I think at the time it was like 85 million or something. It was 3 times the population, I think, of Britain in the day. So they were prognosticating that at the time, again, the late 1800s, that this would be that the United States and Russia would be the two economic powerhouses. But again, the assumption was population and then a productivity imposed upon it. Now, to some extent, that actually came to pass after World War II, but there are many other intervening events that the prognosticators and the crystal ball gazers have not considered. World War II as a case in point, the communist revolution. There are a whole lot of things that they hadn't put into the mix. So the fact that the outcome came, for a brief period at least, I mean, look at Russia today. It's not economically, it's not much more than Mexico, for example. But now we look at other prognosticators. We Parson Thomas Malthus, who had predicted that the world would run out of food because population was growing geometrically. 2, 4, 16. That's and yet food production was growing arithmetically 1, 2, 3, 4. So there was given the population was growing at a much faster rate than food production. This was about 1800. I think a bit before, maybe 1790s. That Malthus came out. He's a British guy. Came out with this, and at the time, his calculations and so on were impeccably correct. You couldn't really fault it, given the then known world. But technology in agriculture and drainage, technology in drainage, draining more land for agriculture, the use of chemicals coming along, fertilizers, other technologies related to food production, food distribution, food transport, food storage, refrigeration as one example. The use of ice blocks to refrigerate food storage. There are a whole lot of things occurred that drastically changed food production, and one of the things that Malthus didn't take into account was the amount of land it was viable to grow crops on or run cattle on or whatever it was, because they couldn't transport their produce to market. Why produce a shitload of wheat if you're going to have to throw it away? But as transport became better, more land could come under cultivation because farmers could get their produce to the markets and even in the late 1800s, even as various types of refrigeration were coming in, it was possible to transport meat that was Australian beef or New Zealand lamb. It was possible to transport that 13,000 miles, 18,000 kilometers, possible to transport that refrigerated and deliver that beef and lamb onto the tables of British consumers, moving it halfway around the world. So it was these sort of things drastically changed the economics of food production and food distribution. So Malthus, even though he was quite correct at the time he made his calculations, there were so many other situations and issues that changed, technological, most of them, that caused his calculations to be incorrect. So coming now to the issue of in 50 plus years time, China and India being the largest economies. Well, China and India have artificially grown. The growth of China and India has been hugely artificial. There've been this globalist project priority was to bring China into the world economic system and India as well. And so vast investments in China and India took place that were artificial. They weren't generated because they made good business sense all around. They were generated for an ideological purpose. So millions of Western jobs were sent offshore to China and India, which had the effect of taking away jobs from the West, but also lowering wages in the West, given that a worker in the United States or Britain was now competing with a peasant worker in India that could live a good middle class lifestyle on $5,000 a year, whereas that equivalent lifestyle would cost 100,000 a year in downtown United States somewhere. So the Western worker is now competing with those workers in the third world. So if you look at, say, China's growth was triple turbocharged by this transference. It was just a transfer of wealth. That's all it was. It was the equivalent of going into the pocket of every Western citizen, stealing money out of their pocket and just giving it to China. That was, and India. India to a lesser extent, but to China in manufacturing, India and more in services, say in IT and call centers, that sort of thing. So that's all it was. So if they'd been left to their own devices, China and India, they wouldn't have grown to anywhere near the same extent. Now, on top of that, it was a productivity decrease. The productivity the productivity of output that declined drastically by putting work offshore to India and China. The productivity decline was only offset by the cheaper wages and the lower standards of things like polluting rivers and streams and air pollution. It was only because they had lower standards and all that the cost of doing business there with the lower wages much less. So I've seen sort of Chinese factories where almost as far as the eye can see, you've just got people sitting at these shoulder to shoulder doing shit jobs, soldering something or stuffing, putting a screw in or sewing on a button or something. You've got all the, and it's only because the wages are so low that sort of unproductive work can be tolerated or accepted. If it was in the West, it would be mechanized. We're seeing a lot of the same things today, in the West, because so much cheap peasant labor, illegal or otherwise, is being brought into the West. It's slowed down managerial processes, automation, mechanization, robotization, slowed that down considerably because this labor is so cheap that it's cheaper than putting a machine in. This was the case in China and India. So you're looking, say, in steel production, lower, poor quality steel. So it's a lower quality product, but by quite a long shot in many cases. But also it's 5 or 6 times less productive than it is in the West. So China and India, their growth has been, I think, almost, well, maybe not entirely, but and they started off at a very low base. Remember, 25 years ago, the total wealth of India was about equal, with their billion plus population, was about equal to that of Australia with a 20 million population. That just goes to show you how fucking poor India was and how much of that wealth that did exist was concentrated amongst, a few million Brahmins at the apex of society, of a caste society that they've got in India. Now, so really the growth, their economic growth has been completely artificial. China and India, and they wouldn't be anywhere near as wealthy as they are today if the West hadn't made that conscious decision. This is the globalist big finance made that conscious decision to steal Western jobs and wealth and simply transfer it. Now the law is that there's 2.5, pushing 3 billion people population in India and China, and so the Western bankers and business people, the globalists, but very few of whom you'd say are intellectually gifted, by the way, privileged but gifted, and they look at these people and say, wow, but then they get this huge hard on over 3 billion new consumers. Holy fuck! But the reality is that they're still, there's over 1 billion starving subsistence peasants in India still. They aren't all middle class people running around in nice cars and living in and they're nearly all of them, and even the Indians that are doing all right are still desperate. They're gagging to come to the West, and they've all got a chip on their shoulder about evil racist white people. Oh fucking! But anyway, so if India and China had that artificial support removed, I mean they've come a way since the that wealth transfer began, then I think they'd fall off pretty quickly. I think as an economy, the Indians have never been able to get their economy together ever, and the Chinese, well, at a time when before industry and mechanization and technology became an issue, China and India had the biggest economies in the world, but only because of population, because one worker was one unit. It turns out the per capita, even in places like England back in the day, the per capita England was much wealthier than India or China, and there was much wider use of things like windmills and water wheels and various other productivity enhancing devices that swamp drainage, these sorts of things that weren't practiced or were practiced less successfully in India or China. So per capita, the wealth was far greater in Britain or France or somewhere like that. So I'm not so sure. I think if that artificial support is removed from India and China, I think they'll stagnate and just go sideways. The only thing the Indians can do is export their surplus population to the West. But there'll be a point if the West does become much poorer, then many Indians would ask the question, well, why would I go there? That the West is now poor and desolate, so why the fuck would I go there? So I don't know if that population shift will continue indefinitely. I don't think it can. And for any Indian or any migrant, it's a value judgment. Can I do better over there than I'm doing, in my home country? And if the answer is I don't know, I'm not sure, maybe not, or definitely not, then they probably wouldn't move. So I think the wealth of India and China and the trajectory they've been on over the last 25, 30 years is very artificial. It's not homegrown. It's not because of their own ingenuity and their own sense of industry or their own inventiveness or innovation. Far from it. It's all Western wealth that's been shoved into them. A bit like we've got brown and black peasants being shoved into us here in the West. It's all artificial. None of it's organic. None of it's natural. So I don't think that India and China will become the world superpowers economic superpowers unless they become highly militaristic societies and they just steal from everybody else. But I don't know. They're already doing all right. The West is already shoveling as much as it can into them. So I don't think they'd have anything to gain. If they impoverish the West, then the artificial support disappears with it. So I'd be very surprised. They could embark on some sort of crazy nationalistic projects, as the Chinese often sort of talk about. They want to recover the glory of the days of the late 1400s and early 1500s when they were as they saw it, the world's preeminent power. The Middle Kingdom, and where all surrounded by these low-life barbarians. They want to seem to recover those dreams of past glory, but I don't think that'll come to pass, or not in the way their propaganda seem to suggest. So what will the future of the world be? Now, I'm not as courageous as these people that put their names to those papers looking 50 years into the future, but I doubt it'll come to pass as of anything like they're looking at. There are too many forces, as I see it, building up that have no outlet or expression in the West. The attempt by the globalists to eradicate white people, for example, it's hysterical. It's got to be the most evil and sinister piece of social engineering on a mass scale that's ever been seen in the world, and it's being posed in what's a normal human evolutionary timeline. It's being imposed in a very short time span by people who are desperate to get it done, get it over the line, so they won't have to worry about it anymore. But I don't think I think those forces at some point will explode. And that will then, the cards will then fall where they may, and the world might be a very, very different place in terms of its possible trajectory than the one that some of these so-called visionaries are thinking about. Could China and India be the world's biggest economies in the future? Well, potentially it's there because they are the biggest populations. And if technology and productivity is uniformly distributed, and I don't believe it ever will be, but if it is, then that probably will come to pass, but only on that basis. The likelihood of technology being uniformly applied and and that everyone's as productive as everyone else. I don't believe that'll happen. I think that's pie in the sky. I think it's the people who are being coloured by this equality of outcome ideological bullshit that's doing the rounds these days. But I doubt it'll happen. But I'll be interested to see your comments below. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for listening.